Hello, I'm Honor Baloo, and welcome to the From the Top podcast, where we have interesting conversations with interesting business leaders. Today, we've got Jane Harley here. Jane is a partner at Skill Equity Partners in London and has over 25 years of success in the world of executive recruiting, executive search. So, an interesting tidbit, Jane and I actually worked together a ways back in London for a few years, and so we've known each other over the years and have remained close. So I'm super excited to have you here today, Jane. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Honor. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Good. All right. Well, tell us a little bit more about what you do and about your business.
Okay. So, as you mentioned, we did have a fun time working in a high growth consultancy firm that some people will have heard of, Alvarez and Marcel, or now A&M as it is. You were head of European operations and convinced me to come on board and build the talent acquisition function. And, you know, it was, I had been working with A&M as a client, so I'd got to know them quite a bit. And, the growth mission was huge and you needed support, and you convinced me to come and do it. So it was amazing because it was a great opportunity to step inside and build a talent acquisition function from scratch. Sometimes the difference between talent acquisition and recruiting is talent acquisition is also that long-term view of your talent planning and what are you trying to achieve this year, but also over the next 3 years, because particularly when you're hiring at a very senior level, it can take 1 to 2, sometimes even 3 years to get those people on board. So it's an important part of educating the business on the culture of recruiting the best talent and how much time that can take. Working with you as an operations leader within the business who also very much valued the cost saving when you are able to attract talent directly as opposed to having to be very reliant on search firms. And I've made a career out of search from Australia, where I joined Morgan and Banks, one of the fastest growing search firms at the time, to spending time in Singapore doing executive search, and then coming to London back in 2001, which is 22 years ago, which seems like a lifetime ago. I never thought I'd be here this long, but I'm still here. And working in around the world in terms of search, really, and but always with professional services predominantly, which is a very dynamic recruiting space, because you're never just looking for the same talent, because it's very cyclic in terms of some of those demands, etc. So working in-house was a very different flip to being an executive search person. And I think the biggest learning going in-house actually was there is no filter on the feedback. So when you are on the other side as a search consultant, you put forward 3 or 4 candidates, you will discuss the feedback, but you will definitely get a slightly more filtered feedback from the business. And I think when you are on the inside, you definitely hear the contrasts of the views and opinions on candidates, which are sometimes quite polarized, which is very, very interesting from that perspective.
I think that's an interesting point that you bring up, is how valuable it is to get different perspectives, because you can have the same candidate who presumably interviews similarly with everybody and have completely different feedback on how they did and how they would fit and whether they'd be a culture fit and whether their skills are at the right level. And that's why it's important to have them talk to several people, right? Because no two people have the same opinions.
And I think I would go even, beyond that. I think it's sometimes the time of day in which you meet people, or the circumstances or the environment in which you meet people will also have an impact on the performance of that interview. So absolutely, you need to have, quite a lot of different decision makers involved in really, you know, important strategic hires, and having a process that is consistent, so it's also very fair for the candidate in that respect.
Interesting. Well, I know that the market is a little different in Europe than it is in the US. That's usually the case, in London specifically. And one of the things that is happening here, and it's fluctuating interestingly with the different generations coming in and the remote work, all those different things. And I want to talk a little bit more about that with you in a few minutes. But one of the issues we're looking at here is, you know, we've got the baby boomers kind of moving out of the workforce, the Gen Zers coming in, and we're going to have 1 million less people in the workforce here than we've had in the past. And so some people are challenged with, how do I attract? It's been competitive. Again, at the moment, it doesn't seem to be as competitive, but it's kind of fluctuating. It's been competitive to attract the best talent. So what advice would you have for people that are looking to differentiate themselves in attracting talent?
Yeah, and you know, regardless as to the cycle, attracting great talent is always difficult, because if they are great talent, that's the reason why. And again, it's a long game when you are looking for that. So I think what's really important is understanding the great talent that you want to hire, and working out how you can start a dialogue and a conversation with that talent, because it doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight with one conversation or two. A lot of the time it's planting those seeds, and your own employees are your best ambassadors of the brand. So it's also, you know, the brand, the culture. You know, LinkedIn is a, you know, it's a phenomenal social network for professionals, and it dominates the landscape pretty much globally. I mean, there is, you know, some smaller competition like, you know, Zing in Germany and some more particular ones, but the reality is LinkedIn is a go-to place for trying to understand a firm or a brand or the talent that are in that brand. So it's very key that you have, you know, regular messaging on LinkedIn that has some element of impact, purpose, meaning that people can engage with.
That's good advice. When you think about your industry in general and you kind of look ahead a little bit, what would you say are the biggest opportunities for your industry over the next 5 years?
So I have just switched back to being on the executive search side of the fence. So I've joined Skill Equity Partners, which is a founder, owner-managed business founded by Olaf Goretzky in Frankfurt. And it's been, you know, 8 years since I've been back on this side of the fence after doing 8 years working with FTI Consulting and their global strategic initiative, or really the EMEA part of that, where we were, you know, double-digit growth for the last sort of 7 years, which was crazy. And they still are growing phenomenally strong. But it was an opportunity to step back out and see what everybody else was doing in the market. And I think there's never been a more interesting time, and particularly in professional services, actually, because there is definitely a slowdown in this market, which, you know, from a recruiting, you know, talent acquisition point of view, is both good and bad, because it does mean that everybody is active listening, I would say, in a downturn, because if they are in a firm that isn't currently growing or is restructuring in some way, it does make people question, is this where I want to be for the next 10 years? Is where I does, you know, does where I am have a strategy that I can buy into? You know, because I think, yes, you are going to go through some pain in terms of reorganization, but then you really need committed people to be able to do that and understand the vision of why they are doing it. So from a, you know, recruiting point of view, though, sometimes what's difficult is when the taps get turned off a bit from recruiting, you know, that everybody thinks, oh, we're not hiring anymore, so you must be doing nothing in recruiting. Surely you're just, you know, filing your nails now, or whatever it is. And of course, actually, it's the best time to actually really do the analysis on your ideal talent base and who it is that you want to target, and actually spend time researching what they're doing, what they're posting about, what could be interesting, why it's interesting, all the things that you never have time to do when you are just actively focusing on filling the roles and the demands that are right here now. So you can actually start working on your 2026 hiring strategy as opposed to just being focused on 2024, 2025. So it's, yeah, I think it's a good time to really invest in that longer term talent strategy.
Okay, that's good advice. So you talk to a lot of candidates, obviously senior level candidates that are considering changes. What are some of the reasons that they would make a change?
Well, that's the fascinating part. I think that you have to believe as a headhunter that no never means never, or you probably wouldn't do the job,
Right,
because it just doesn't. And you know, by virtue of doing it for more than 25 years, you definitely know that no doesn't mean
right.
never. You know, and there's a timing in life is everything, and sometimes people just need a change. And I think that's what we saw as a result of COVID, actually. And
Mm,
that's why there was such a huge amount of hiring activity in 2021 across all firms, but particularly in consulting, because people had experienced a different way of living and working as well. I mean, maybe, you know, having, you know, worked a lot with American firms, there was already a lot of remote working happening in the US. Yeah. Whereas here, and particularly in London at the time, it was not, you know, it was kind of odd to be sent home to work. Here's an office chair, here's your laptop, don't come back. And, you know, it was nearly 2 years
yeah.
of people's lives living that way. And everybody has so many stories and tragedies and awakenings and everything that happened during that time period. And your career is, you know, it's one of the most, it's the biggest part of your life in so many ways. It might not be the most important, but in terms of hours spent,
Right.
it's definitely up there. So a lot of people started to think about, what else could I do? Some people completely pivoted and changed
Yeah.
careers.
Yeah.
Also, I think remote working and hybrid working opened opportunities to firms where location was no longer an
Mm-hmm.
issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even thinking about coming back into search 8 years later from when I was last, you know, in search in between the in-house roles, you know, the borderless way in which we can work is now normal. You know, so as an, you know, executive search owner, manager, boutique, you know, yes, our predominant market is Germany and the UK. But the reality is, you know, in the last 3 months, I've been working in Canada, Luxembourg, um, you know, Middle East, France, you know, everywhere without needing to actually travel. So the cost of doing business for a lot of, you know, boutiques has come
Right.
down significantly,
Mm-hmm.
which is exciting. And when you think about cyclic hiring, it means that you don't have to be restricted to just where you live. And I think COVID and the job market really changed that significantly. But sometimes people want to leave a firm because of career progression. Absolutely, there's a glass ceiling, or you know, they feel that the sunsetter above them is never leaving until they retire. So they come to that reality. Also, I think, you know, one of the groups that a lot of the time in house people would want to try and hire would be the kind of senior manager, senior director level,
Mm-hmm.
rather than make the bigger investment in the partner. Let's get a few from below, and let's, you know, bring them in, be able to get them, you know, a bit more molded into the culture, etc. And that ultimately means that they're a 30 something person, I would say.
Okay.
And sometimes the challenge with recruiting that group is they're often, you know, getting married for the first time, having their children for the first time,
Yeah.
buying a house for the first time, or doing all of these things where all of a sudden their personal life is going to take a priority that maybe changes what they think about they need with their career with the next 5 or 10
Right.
years or whatever it is. And sometimes it's circumstances in your own life where you just want change and you want a change of scenery, or you want a bigger platform or a smaller platform to work from. And sometimes it's just pure spontaneity or fate for some people that you meet someone and it takes you to another place. And I definitely had that opportunity earlier in my career as well. I was in Western Australia, married with one young son, and I got an offer to go to a job in Singapore, which I didn't even purely understand, with a startup. And it was crazy. And I said to my husband, I don't know, should we do this? He had to sell his business then to do it. And he was like, yeah, let's do it. So literally packed up and moved to Singapore, and took a job with not really thinking that much about it. And that kind of set us off on a new adventure. So I think not every job works out. If it did, life would be so easy. So there's
Right.
always risk when you move. So when I'm on, as a headhunter, hopefully I'm guiding people with the information I have about the firm, because they've obviously got to make their own decisions that this is a great next career move for them. And sometimes, depending on what you ultimately want, whether that's becoming a CEO or, chief data officer or whatever that role is, you might need to do a couple of roles in between to start filling the requirements for
Sure.
the breadth of some of those roles. So yeah, I think, and like I said, when someone has said no, they're not interested and they'd never go to that firm or whatever, anything can happen in 2 years. And like I said, when people start actively listening, they think differently about what could be attractive about that role. And so as a headhunter, you're always trying to work out what those buttons are that you're going to press, what's going to make them listen to you. Because sometimes when I'm on this side, you've only got one shot at a call with them or an
Right.
introduction.
Right.
um, and if they're really not in active listening mode, then you've got to try and work out why would they want to make this move, what could be in it for them in terms of that, so you can at least start the conversation.
It sounds like patience is kind of required from all sides. From your
Definitely.
side, because based on your experience, that sometimes, no doesn't mean never, like you said, it just means not
Yep.
now.
Yep.
And even patience from a candidate's perspective, if they're looking for something specific in terms of the culture or
Mhm.
the leadership at the top
Yep.
level,
Mhm.
and they've got to wait till they find the right place. And then on the
Mhm.
company side, you have in mind what you're looking for. And sometimes that isn't necessarily what you end up with, because you may start out thinking you need X, and then you meet somebody like you mentioned, and you say,
Mhm.
actually, this is a better fit. I hadn't thought about it, but this is a better fit. But sometimes you have to be patient till you feel like it's the right person. You've gone through the process, you've had other people talk to them, you've evaluated their
Mhm.
skills, their background, their personality type, how would they be
Yep.
to work with? How would they fit into the culture? So many different things when you're dealing with humans to consider,
Yep.
right?
Yeah. But interestingly, I think no matter how logical or analytical or anyone I've dealt with, there's still an element when crunch comes, that they will rely on what their gut tells them or
Yeah.
what their kind of intuition is saying about that move. And of course, sometimes you think you've won them over and they're coming, and then there's the counter offer. And I would say that in the market that we're in, this is what gets interesting, because you have people who in a downturn, there are a couple of things. One, cash is king. People are
Yeah.
less sold on the kind of dream of equity and the likes, and what we might be in 5, 10 years if they're leaving quite a solid
Yeah.
foundation to do a
Mhm.
startup. I think when you've seen a lot of startups not make it, or even really big startups like we're seeing, with loads of money, all of a sudden they're bankruptcy or whatever it is. So it puts and you've only got to read the newspaper, sadly, to not have the most optimistic view of what's going on in the world. So when people are surrounded by that information, they are much more risk averse, and they're likely to be in a firm that is talking about cost cutting and all of those things. So therefore, they're harder to move in that sense because the risk
Right.
alert goes higher.
Mhm.
But like I said, that process where you can get them comfortable with making that transition is not over until they join. And the counter offer, and that's something with being in-house that I've seen a lot of. And I would say that actually firms don't do it very well in terms of that. I
Make the
think
counter offer. They don't make counter offers very well.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Say
I
more
think
about that.
yeah, I think because I think you've really got to understand the emotions behind why they want to make that move. And sometimes it's just very hard for it not to get personal. Yeah. And I even, there was a partner at one of the larger consulting firms who had lost a lot of talent in his team to a particular competitor who was making a very big cash incentive for them to
Mhm.
pick up and go over there. And a few of them had come back because they didn't like the culture of where they'd been, for example. But he was getting so frustrated with this that he said, "That's it. I'm not letting any of them come back. If they go, it's on their own." And you're like, well, again, short term
Right.
and short sighted because great talent is great talent. And great talent makes well, not bad decisions, but perhaps moves that didn't work for them. And sometimes,
Sure.
particularly if you're homegrown, the grass is going to look greener. And actually, I think it's a good thing sometimes for talent to go and experience somewhere else and realize that where they were was better. So I think, the boomerang has been quite a powerful theme through COVID as well, actually. Because again, some people have gone, actually, when I sit and reflect, I had a really good time. And maybe I could go back. Whereas actually, if you ask your friends and relatives 9 out of 10 times, because I've dealt with quite a lot of boomerang hiring, which is similar to the counter office argument. You'll ask your external friends and family, well, I've got this job offer, but I've been counter offered. I don't know what to do now. Usually the friends and family will say, depends. If they're very much on the conservative side, they stay where you are. You know it. Da, da, da. The others will be, well, you wouldn't have been looking for a job. You wouldn't have gone and got that job if you weren't happy with where you
Mhm.
are. So I think take the role. And I think, with the boomerang one, it's often never go back. People just tell you never go back. But again, it's always different things for different people as to what makes them successful in their next move. But I think sometimes with the likes of the counter offer or the boomerang, it can become personal for some of the individuals who are involved in that process, and you've really got to make sure you remove that and understand the reasoning behind it, and then also make sure that you can counter that offer in terms of what it is, not financially, because that's not always what it's about, but it is a driver for some people
Sure.
to move. Absolutely. We've got high interest rates, you've got mortgages, you've got cost of living. If someone's going to offer you a lot more money, well, that's going to be pretty darn tempting. And that, firms can't counter everybody's move,
Right.
or that becomes setting too much of a precedent. But it's just really important that you take the time to understand why, and you leave it on a positive no matter which way it goes. But 9 out of 10 times people who take the counter offer leave within 12 months.
So yeah. There was something that wasn't being met inside them, right? So they were
Yeah.
looking or they were open, but then the money got their attention, right? So they stayed a little bit longer and then realized that didn't fill the hole that I had identified to begin with. So they ended up
Correct.
staying. So
Yeah.
I think that's something important for companies to realize when they're considering making counteroffers. And maybe in some cases it still makes sense because in the short term you need somebody and maybe it'll give you a little bit more time to sort of start, as you were saying, sometimes this can take 1, 2, or 3 years. We'll start to have some of those conversations or start to connect with some people that might be a good fit for that because they're likely to leave in the end anyway. Yeah.
Yes. Correct. Yeah.
Good. Well, Jane, one question I'm curious about, and this is something that fascinates me about everybody is that success is really defined differently for everybody. So I'm curious how you define success and what, what comes to mind for you when you think about success.
Um, I think it's so many things. Sometimes success is just getting through a difficult day or a difficult period that you've gone through, both personally or work-wise. Um,
Yeah.
Ultimately, for me personally, it's balance. It's being able to balance family, friends, work, and have time to be a whole person and not just kind of one dimensional in that sense. Always feel like you're, spinning a lot of plates and sometimes getting nowhere. So, taking time to reflect on your success. But I think also taking time to imagine what else your success could be. And I think, I'm always inspired by people who have had multiple careers that are quite different to each other because I think it's more interesting. I think, sometimes, when and I look at my son doing his A levels right now, and, you're going into the world of university and what am I going to study and what am I going to do? And actually, if you're young, why can't you think of having 3 or 4 careers? Doesn't have to be just one career. And again, I reflect back to COVID, seeing a lot of people start their own businesses and do
Mhm.
something that they were passionate about or was their side hustle that they've, and I think that's an amazing story. And that's, careers evolve all the time. So when you were talking about, 1 million people leaving the workforce, but there's always jobs that didn't exist 2, 3,
True.
4 years ago. So I think it's success is constantly um, being willing to explore what success can mean for you as an individual, because I think it's a really individual thing. It's not some people might crave awards or recognition or whatever, but for me it's balance. Yeah, because I like life and I like spending time. Yes, I love what I do, absolutely, but also I love playing sport, love spending time with my family, with my friends, with my dogs, all of those things. So that's how I would look at, does my life feel successful? Do I have balance and do I have time to do the things that I love doing?
Jane, you are an inspiration to me and I'm sure to a lot of people because you've always had this huge zest for life and you've always been able to balance it. I mean, and there are times when work is super demanding, but you've always had hobbies. You have so many different interests. You've got a great group of friends. You pull people together, have fun social events, and then you have your family, which is important to you too. And more I hear from business leaders how how much of a struggle it is to find that balance, but also how important it is to them, and when they're in different stages of life, it's different levels of importance. You talked about earlier when you start to have children or when your children get to a certain age or whatever, you realize, gosh, I've been working 70-hour weeks and now I don't want to because my kids are doing some things I want to be there, and you have to learn how to create those boundaries and how to still be effective at what you do and be present, with your family. And you've always made that a priority. And I have always admired that about you. So thank you so much for taking the time today to talk with me. You're always
Thank you.
fascinating and have great insight and input and are just, fun to talk to. So I just want to tell you how grateful I am to see you and to spend this time with you. Thanks so
Well,
much,
thank
Jane.
you. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much, Honor Blue. Good to see you.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.